The room was cold and quiet as the cadets took their seats in the academy hall, where the final exam would begin soon, and no one dared to speak louder than a whisper, because everyone knew what was at stake and failure was not an option for those who wished to join Earth's defense fleet, and were the silver badge of honor that marked them as protectors of humanity across the stars. In the third row near the edge of the room sat a girl who barely moved and barely spoke and barely seemed to exist among the crowd of sharp and eager minds who had trained for years to be here and now stood on the edge of their future or their failure. Her name was Lena Ward, and she had always been different from the others, and not in the way that made people stare or ask questions or praise her for brilliance or skill, but in the quiet way that made people forget she was even there at all, like a shadow, sitting still and breathing slowly and listening to everything without giving away even a single thought. The other cadets called her Ghost, and the name stuck because she walked without sound and answered only when asked, and never raised her hand unless she was certain of the answer, and even then she spoke with a voice so soft it seemed to come from another room and drift into the ears like a breeze through a broken window. Some said she was strange, and others said she was slow, but no one thought she was dangerous or even interesting, and that was why no one paid her any attention as the exam began, and the doors locked behind them, and the large screen at the front of the room flickered to life with the words that made even the boldest cadets hold their breath. Identify the threat. That was the name of the test, and it was simple in theory and cruel in design, because this was not about strategy or teamwork or physical strength or even leadership, but about one thing only: the ability to see danger before it strikes and to act without hesitation, even when the answer is not clear and the consequences are real. This was the test that had removed the top cadet last year and two before that, and was said to be impossible to cheat or prepare for because it changed every time, and no one knew what to expect or where the threat would come from or what it would look like, or even if it would be human at all. The lights dimmed, and the simulation began, and the room around them melted away, replaced by the cold steel interior of a space station with blinking lights and soft alarms echoing through the corridors, and 10 figures standing at the front of the hall dressed in various uniforms and clothes, some looking calm and others nervous, and some clearly armed and ready to fight. The voice of the instructor came through the speakers flat and steady, as always, saying you must choose the threat, and you must act within the time limit, or the consequences will be simulated in full, and failure will mean dismissal from the program with no second attempt and no appeal. The cadets immediately jumped into action, some shouting orders and others whispering theories about the people in front of them, trying to guess which one was the enemy or the saboteur or the killer or the alien in disguise, and one cadet pointed at the man with the gun while another said, "It must be the woman with the scar across her eye," and yet another said the real danger was the alien with the silver skin who stood perfectly still and watched them all without blinking. Lena said nothing and stayed in her seat in row 3, her hands on her lap and her eyes scanning the simulation without judgment or fear or even interest, and she blinked slowly as she watched her classmates scramble and argue and form little groups that quickly broke apart as the pressure rose, and the clock ticked down in the top corner of the screen like a bomb waiting to go off. The instructor said nothing more, and the figures in the simulation remained motionless except for small movements that made them seem more real than digital, and one of them tapped their foot, and another coughed, and another tilted their head, as if listening for something no one else could hear. Still Lena waited and watched, and her breathing remained calm and steady like a metronome in a silent room, and her classmates barely noticed her presence, if they noticed at all, because she was not part of their plans or their teams or their guesses, and to them, she was just the quiet girl in the third row who never spoke unless spoken to, and never offered anything more than the minimum required to pass. But Lena was watching everything, not just the figures at the front, but the entire room, the placement of the lights, the angle of the shadows, the way the simulation reacted to each voice and each movement, and even how the floor vibrated beneath her boots when someone shouted or stepped too hard. And she was not just looking for the threat, she was studying the test itself. One cadet jumped forward and pointed at the woman with the scar, saying, "She's the one. I saw her hand move. She's hiding something," and the simulation responded with a sudden alarm and flashing red lights. And the woman reached under her coat, and pulled out a long knife and rushed forward, and 3 figures fell before the scene faded and reset with a loud buzz, and the cadet who made the call was ejected from the room as a failure. The others gasped and looked around more carefully, now realizing that the test was not going to be easy or fair or forgiving. And one of them whispered to the boy next to her that maybe the threat wasn't even one of the 10 people, maybe it was something else, maybe it was one of us. Lena heard the whisper and tilted her head slightly, but said nothing, and her eyes narrowed as she looked once more at the control panel near the simulation wall, and at the instructor's shadow behind the glass in the observation room, and at the way the simulation looped in small, almost invisible ways like a program running just a little too smoothly to be real. The room was growing hotter, now not from the air, but from the tension, the weight of the exam pressing down on every cadet's shoulders and making their minds race, and their hands shake, and their instincts scream at them to do something, anything before the clock hit 0, and the system judged them as failures too slow, too blind, too human. But Lena remained still in row 3, her thoughts moving faster than her eyes, and her eyes moving faster than her body, as she waited and listened and prepared to move not toward the suspects, but toward something else, something no one else had seen, yet something hidden in plain sight. And the clock kept ticking. The room around them shifted again as the simulation adjusted in real time, reacting to the guesses and mistakes of the cadets who still remained in the test chamber, where silence now held more power than sound, and the air felt thicker with every passing second, like the pressure before a storm that everyone knows is coming but cannot stop. The 10 figures at the front were no longer just shadows or data. They were fully formed people, or at least they looked like people with faces and bodies and eyes that watched the cadets without blinking or reacting like statues alive only on the inside, where secrets and danger lived waiting to strike when no one was looking. Some wore uniforms from enemy fleets known to the cadets through endless hours of study and simulation training. Some wore civilian, clothing torn or dirty as if from a crash or a battlefield. Others wore black armor with symbols that flickered like broken code, as if their identity changed every few seconds. They stood side by side, without speaking, each holding something in their hands or hiding something behind their backs. One held a data pad, another a small glowing cube, and one stood with empty hands and a quiet smile that made several cadets uneasy without knowing why. The remaining cadets began whispering again, but now their voices were lower, less certain, less loud than before, their confidence wounded by the failure of the first bold guess that had ended in a bloody scene and a cold ejection that reminded them this was not a simple game to win by shouting first or loudest. A tall cadet named Cass pointed at the figure with the glowing cube and said, "I've seen those used as triggers for plasma bombs," and his voice shook a little as he stepped closer, trying to see better through the flickering holograms that formed the walls and floor of the simulated room. But he did not act yet. Another cadet named Rel shook her head and said, "No, that one is a decoy. The real threat is the alien in the middle. Look at the eyes, no blink, no breath. That's not human." And the others nodded or murmured agreement as their eyes turned to the tall, silver-skinned figure who had not moved since the test began and still stood perfectly straight with arms behind its back like a soldier or a predator in disguise. But not everyone was looking at the obvious suspects, because Lena Ward was still in row 3 with her fingers pressed gently against the edge of her seat and her eyes scanning not just the figures, but the shadows behind them, the reflections in the metal floor, the shimmer in the digital wall at the far end of the room that pulsed in a strange rhythm like a heartbeat made from code. No one saw her glance at the light in the ceiling that flickered for only half a second, or the way one of the figures cast no reflection on the metal behind them, or the fact that every sound in the room was slightly delayed by less than a breath, as if the system itself was hesitating before revealing the truth hidden behind the scene. A third cadet named Brax finally stepped forward and raised his voice to say the threat is the woman with the data pad. Her fingers are typing even when the screen is dark. She's inputting commands for something, maybe a virus or a lockdown code. We have to stop her. Before anyone could stop him, he stepped into the interaction zone and pointed directly at the woman in question, who slowly raised her head and stared at him with a calm expression that held neither fear nor surprise, only a strange sense of waiting, like a door left open in a storm. The screen above flashed red, and a shrill tone rang through the chamber, and the woman's eyes glowed blue for a moment before she exploded into motion, her hands reaching behind her to pull two long knives from her coat and throwing them faster than the eye could follow straight into the hearts of two simulated hostages who had been standing behind a console. The cadets screamed as the scene shifted again, this time showing the deaths in full slow motion as the knives flew and the bodies fell, and the simulation reset with a soft click that sounded more final than a gunshot, and Brax was gone, pulled from the test without a word. Only 7 cadets remained now, and silence returned to the room like a thick blanket, choking the noise and panic from the air as each one began to understand what the test was really about, not just spotting a threat, but seeing through layers of illusion to find the truth that others ignored. Still, Lena did not move from her place in row 3, and her heart beat steady and slow like a rhythm. She had practiced for years, breathing in the tension of the room and breathing out her fear until nothing remained but thought and vision and the quiet certainty that she was seeing what others could not or would not see. The simulation adjusted again, this time flickering slightly, as if glitching for just a moment, showing the background wall melting into code before returning to the false metal of the space station. And this time a chair appeared behind one of the suspects, and the lighting shifted to cast longer shadows, and the clock above their heads ticked louder than before. The cadets were sweating now, not from heat, but from pressure, their uniforms soaked with the effort of staying calm, while their minds ran wild, searching for clues among the distractions and obvious answers that kept turning into deadly traps each time someone chose wrong. Cass took a step back and said, "Maybe none of them are the threat. Maybe it's a trick. Maybe it's one of us." And the others turned to look at each other, suddenly unsure, suddenly aware of how close they stood and how quickly trust could dissolve under pressure. Rel laughed, but it was a sharp, nervous sound that held no real humor, and said, "If one of us is the threat, then we've already failed because we're wasting time and no one has made a move since Brax got pulled. Maybe the real danger is that we keep guessing wrong and forget to act." Still, Lena awaited, her hands still, her eyes still, and her thoughts building layer upon layer of observation, like a tower rising above the fog of panic and confusion. And she was not looking for a person with a weapon or a disguise or a secret. She was looking for the flaw in the pattern, the thing that did not belong, the silence and the noise. She leaned slightly forward and blinked slowly, and for a moment her eyes narrowed as she looked at the simulation with something deeper than suspicion, something closer to recognition, and a quiet understanding passed through her like a whisper from the machine itself. There was again a flicker, a breath of movement, where none should be, not from the figures, not from the cadets, but from the walls, from the system, from the very code that held the test together, and she realized something the others had not yet seen. This test was not about the suspects. It was about the simulation itself, and the clock kept ticking louder with every beat. The lights flickered again as the simulation reset for the 4th time, and now only 7 cadets stood in the vast hollow room where the steel walls shimmered with false reflections, and the air felt thinner than before, like every breath had to be earned in silence and fear, while the glowing timer on the wall showed less than 20 minutes remaining, and every second passed like a warning whisper in the back of their minds. No one spoke now, and even the boldest cadets stood frozen, as if any movement would trigger another failure and another removal from the test, which now felt less like a simulation and more like a trap set to break the weak and punish the careless without mercy or explanation. Lena Ward remained in row 3, just as she had from the beginning, and her body was still while her eyes kept moving from corner to corner, from face to face, from shadow to screen, tracking not the suspects, but the lines behind the simulation where the code pulsed like veins beneath the surface of a living thing waiting to strike. The other cadets were falling apart one by one, not from injury or violence, but from doubt and silence, and the fear that perhaps there was no right answer and no threat at all, or worse, that the threat was them, and they had already failed just by thinking the test was fair or even real. Rel broke first, her voice shaking as she stepped forward and shouted at the tall alien figure in the center, saying, "You're the only one who hasn't moved. You're the threat, I know it." And she raised her hand in the simulation and pointed directly at the figure whose silver skin glinted like moonlight and whose blank eyes turned slowly to meet hers. The figure did not move, and the screen above turned red again as the alarms blared and the scene exploded into chaos with flashing lights and falling debris, and the silver figure raising one hand to reveal a small device that pulsed once and triggered a series of explosions that tore through the simulated station, leaving digital fire and screams in its wake. Rel disappeared from the chamber without a word, pulled out like the others before her, while the room reset with a quiet hiss, and the remaining cadets looked at each other with eyes wide and hands clenched, afraid to guess, afraid to speak, and now only 6 remained standing in a room that felt colder than ever and far too empty. Cass was next, and his mistake was slower, more careful, and still wrong because he waited too long watching every figure trying to catch a mistake or a twitch or a shift in weight, and when he finally stepped forward, he hesitated for just a second before pointing to the woman with the scar who had not moved since the second reset. He whispered his answer, and the system did not respond at first, and the silence stretched so long that the others thought maybe he was right or maybe the test was over, and then the lights dropped, and the figure lunged forward with a blade hidden in her sleeve and brought down 2 simulated guards before she vanished, and Cass vanished too, taken out with a quiet sound like breath, leaving the body after one last mistake. 5 cadets, now 5 minds full of fear and failure and confusion, standing in a room that kept shifting and bending in small ways like a dream, trying to hold shape while reality pushed against it, and only Lena remained untouched, unshaken, watching with calm eyes and still hands, as if waiting for something none of the others could see. The instructor's voice returned then, quiet and calm, as ever, saying time is slipping and decisions must be made or you will all be judged by your silence. And that alone sent 2 more cadets into action, desperate to avoid the shame of inaction or the fear of being the last to choose. They chose quickly and wrongly, and the simulation punished them both in new and creative ways, explosions for one, suffocation for the other, both gone in seconds, and now the room held only 3 figures among the cadets, and the weight of the exam pressed down like gravity had doubled, or the walls had moved closer in secret while they were too busy guessing to notice. One of the last remaining cadets, a girl named Vika, turned to Lena for the first time and asked softly, "What are you waiting for?" And the words hung in the air unanswered as Lena looked at her without speaking and then turned her gaze back to the screen where the timer showed less than 5 minutes remaining, and the pressure in the room made it feel like the floor might crack open and swallow them whole. Vika hesitated, then stepped forward and looked at all 10 suspects again, her eyes darting from face to face, looking for fear or anger or guilt and finding none, and she whispered, "I don't know," and then took a step back, her voice breaking as she said, I don't know," and then she vanished too, because the test did not care for hesitation or honesty or fear, only action and truth, and now only 2 cadets remained in the chamber. One was Lena, who had not moved from her seat in row 3, and the other was a boy named Kez, who stood stiff with tension, staring at the suspects and muttering numbers under his breath, as if counting something important, and he looked at Lena and said, "Are you going to do anything, or are you just going to sit there and wait until we both fail?" Lena said nothing, and her gaze was locked on the back wall now, where the control panel flickered for just a second and then returned to normal, and she stood at last slow and quiet like a shadow, stretching in the light. And for the first time since the test began, every eye turned toward her, every figure, every sensor, every line of code, tracking her movement like a ripple across still water. She walked down the aisle of empty chairs where cadets once sat before their failures, and her footsteps made no sound, and her eyes never blinked as she moved toward the center of the room, not toward the suspects, not toward the other cadet, but toward the wall itself, the place no one else had looked, the place where the simulation had blinked like a living eye trying to stay shut. Kez shouted after her, "What are you doing? The thread is right there." And he pointed at the last suspect on the right, man in a lab coat who held a small black case with blinking lights that no one had opened yet. But Lena kept walking, and her hand rose slowly toward the wall, toward the system, toward the lie. The clock reached 1 minute remaining, and the walls began to hum with power, as if warning them both that the end was near, and Kez screamed, "You're going to fail, do something now." And Lena stopped just in front of the control panel, her fingers hovering over a small hidden switch that no one else had noticed. She turned once to look back, and her voice came clear and calm and strong as she said, "I already did." And the wall pulsed again. The hum in the walls grew louder as the last minute of the exam began, and the glowing numbers on the overhead timer ticked down like a warning in red light, while the air inside the simulation chamber felt heavier than before, and the floor beneath their boots seemed to vibrate like a heart beating faster with every breath. Kez stood frozen, his eyes darting between the suspects lined up at the front and the girl who had walked away from the game from the guesses from the fear, and now stood with one hand hovering over the side panel like she had seen something that no one else had seen, and he wanted to believe she was wrong, because if she was right, then everything they had trained for, everything they had been told, was a lie wrapped inside a test meant to break them. Lena Ward stood with her back to the room, her hair pulled back tight, her uniform pressed neat, and clean, her fingers steady as they moved to the side of the control system hidden just under the simulation wall. And she knelt slowly, her eyes never leaving the small blinking node that pulsed like a secret heart hidden behind fake metal. The timer showed 45 seconds left, and the voice of the instructor returned through the speaker, not shouting, not urgent, but flat and calm, like always, saying the threat must be identified before the simulation ends, or all remaining cadets will be marked as non-responsive and removed from command track without review. Kez took a step toward the front, his hand shaking as he pointed again at the suspect in the lab coat, the one holding the small black case with blinking lights, who had not moved since the third reset. And Kez shouted, "He has to be the one, no one else fits the pattern, and the others already caused failures, and she's wasting time." The simulation did not react, and neither did the suspect, and the silence was louder than his voice as his hand dropped, and he turned to Lena again, watching her tap softly against the side panel and pull it open, revealing wires and nodes, and something else, something glowing that did not match the training diagrams or the system schematics they had all memorized for months. She reached inside the panel, and the lights above flickered, not as part of the simulation, but as if the real power inside the system had shifted, and the figures at the front shimmered for just a second like static in a screen or ghosts caught between signals, and for the first time a line between real and not real started to break. The timer showed 30 seconds left, and Kez screamed again, saying, "What are you doing? What are you trying to prove? That the system is broken, that the test is a lie, we're cadets, not engineers, you're going to get us both removed." Lena stood slowly, turning toward him, her expression calm, her voice soft but clear. She said, "I'm not trying to prove anything, I already did." And with one hand, she reached behind her and flipped the switch hidden under the panel, just as the figures in front of them all turned their heads in perfect sync and began walking toward the cadets without warning. The timer reached 20 seconds, and everything in the room began to distort, the walls bending inward, the lights pulsing red, the simulation no longer a controlled training scenario, but something alive reacting to the action. Lena had taken something angry, something real. Kez backed away, shouting at the figures as they approached, their eyes glowing, their steps in rhythm like machines, not people. And he shouted again, "This isn't the test anymore. This isn't part of the program. This is wrong. This is broken." Lena stepped forward between him and the figures and held up her hand palm open, and the figures stopped mid-step, heads, tilted eyes flickering, and then one by one, they turned and vanished like mist blown away by a sudden wind, and the room returned to stillness with the hum of power reduced to a soft breath. 10 seconds remained, and Lena turned to face the overhead sensor, the eye of the system, the watcher behind the test. And she said this was never about finding a threat. It was about seeing the system for what it is, a trap designed to expose not weakness, but vision, and if no one sees it, then the system wins. The lights above turned white again, soft and clean, and the walls stopped moving, and the timer froze at 5 seconds before vanishing completely, and the voice of the instructor returned, but this time not from the speaker, this time from the doorway, as he stepped into the room with 3 officers behind him watching in silence. The instructor looked at Kez, who stood shaking with confusion and fear, and then at Lena, who stood straight and calm, her hands at her sides, her eyes focused. And he said, "The test is over, you may stand down." Kez opened his mouth to speak, but no words came as he looked around the room, which now felt empty again, like nothing had happened, like everything had been erased in 1 second, and only memory remained as proof that it was ever real. Lena did not move except to glance once more at the panel still open at the sidewall, where the system core blinked quietly, like it was waiting for someone else to try again, someone else to see what it really was. The instructor stepped closer, and said this test has been used for 7 years, and no cadet has ever opened the wall or questioned the simulation or disabled the figures before they attacked, and for that reason you are now assigned to Advanced Command Track effective immediately, and your file will be reviewed for further special placement. He looked at Kez and added you are dismissed and will return to standard evaluation. Your decision, making under pressure, is to be reviewed and corrected as necessary before graduation. Kez said nothing as he turned and walked away, his boots heavy, his steps slow, like someone walking out of a dream that had turned into a nightmare, and then into something worse, something he could not name. Lena remained standing, her eyes on the instructor, who now nodded once before leaving with the other officers, and the door closed behind them with a softness that felt more like an ending than a beginning. The lights dimmed once more as the system powered down, and the wall panel slid closed with a soft click as if it had never been opened, and the room fell silent again, with only the hum of air vents and the echo of forgotten footsteps on cold metal. Lena turned and walked back to row 3, her place, her seat, still there waiting like it had always known she would return, and she sat down slowly, placing her hands in her lap and breathing in once deep and steady as the memory of the test faded from the walls, but not from her mind. The threat had never been the suspects or the weapons or the simulation itself. The real threat was believing that the system was always right, and she had seen through it, because she was never part of the noise. She was the silence that watched and waited, and then moved when no one else would. Outside the chamber, the hallway stretched long and empty, its walls lined with steel and silence, broken only by the sound of Lena's footsteps as she walked alone past closed doors and hidden eyes and cameras that watched without blinking, as if trying to understand what she had done and why she had done it. Inside her mind, the scene still played again and again, the blinking lights, the frozen timer, the moment the figures stopped moving and vanished like they had never been real, and maybe they never were, or maybe they were something else, something older than the simulation, older than the test, something built to watch what cadets would do when pushed to the edge of what they understood. She kept walking past training rooms and simulation bays, past instructors who stepped aside when they saw her, past cadets who stared in silence and said nothing because they had heard already somehow the story spreading faster than light through the academy halls, how the girl from row 3 had broken the system and passed the test in a way no one else ever had. They looked at her differently now, not with kindness, not with anger, but with something else, with a strange fear mixed with curiosity, like they could not decide if she had cheated or won or done something they could never understand. Lena did not stop, she did not speak, she did not return their stares. She only walked with purpose until she reached the elevator at the far end of the hall and placed her hand on the scanner, which lit up in soft blue, and opened the doors with a hiss of approval that seemed almost surprised. Inside the elevator, she stood still as it rose through the floors, carrying her higher into the restricted levels, where only a few were allowed, and only when summoned, and her reflection stared back at her from the mirrored walls, her face, calm, her eyes unreadable, her hands steady at her sides. The doors opened to a white corridor with soft lights that made no shadows and silent guards who did not move as she passed between them toward the briefing room at the end, where 3 officers waited behind a black desk with screens and data pads and unreadable expressions that reminded her of statues carved from ice. They did not greet her, and she did not expect them to. Instead, she stood before them with her hand behind her back, her posture straight, her breathing slow and quiet, as the officer in the center spoke, without looking up from his screen. Cadet Ward, you were observed during exam 9 simulation variant Echo, and your actions deviated significantly from all expected patterns, yet the outcome was successful with 0 virtual casualties and full threat neutralization, despite no identification of any individual suspect as the primary threat. He paused and looked up, his eyes sharp like knives as he said, "Explain." Lena nodded once and said the test was not about the suspects. It was about perception. It was about seeing past what we were told to look at, about realizing that the system itself was a threat, not because it failed, but because it controlled everything and we were never told to question it. The second officer leaned forward slightly, her fingers tapping once against her data pad, as she said, "And what gave you the right to assume that the system could be challenged?" Lena looked at her without flinching and said, because every test has a flaw, and if the system is perfect, then there's nothing to learn and no reason to test us. And I do not believe they built this academy to train machines who only follow instructions. I believe they built it to find people who can see what others miss. The third officer said nothing. He only watched with an expression that never changed, and Lena met his gaze without blinking, because she had already passed the only test that mattered, the one that was never written in the manual and never spoken out loud, the test of choosing to see the invisible threat and daring to move toward it alone. The first officer finally said, "Very well, you are to be reassigned effective immediately to Intelligence Section 9 under closed classification. All further training will be handled off-site and your record sealed until graduation." He stood and added, "Dismissed." Lena nodded once and turned to leave, and the doors opened before she reached them. The hallway, now brighter than before, like the walls themselves, had changed in response to her choice, as if the building knew that something different had happened, something new, something not in the plan. As she walked back through the academy, the whispers followed her, softer now, but still present like wind through tall grass, always moving, always watching, and she ignored them not out of pride, but because she had no need to answer them, because she knew what she had seen and what she had done, and nothing else mattered now. Later that night, she sat alone in her dorm room. Her bunk neatly made, her desk empty, her data pad dark and silent, and outside the window the stars blinked across the black sky, like a map of paths not yet walked and dangers not yet faced, and she stared at them for a long time, thinking of the exam and the figures and the way they had moved in perfect silence like echoes of something long gone. She wondered if they had been real once, or if they were only code, or if perhaps the simulation was older than the academy itself, a system built from something no one fully understood and now forgotten except by the machine that ran it and tested each cadet, as if looking for someone specific, someone who could see through its skin of rules and fire. A soft beep came from her door, and she stood to open it, revealing a small message pod resting on the floor with no sender ID and no light except a soft red blink at the top. And when she picked it up, it opened in her hand without a code and displayed a single line of text that made her pause. "You are not alone." She closed the pod and looked down the hallway, but it was empty and quiet and still, and she placed the pod on her desk and sat back down, her thoughts shifting like shadows in low light. Because for the first time, she wondered if someone had been watching her, not just the instructors, not just the academy, but something else, something older, something behind the test, behind the system, behind the very idea of training itself. She looked once more at the stars, and this time she saw them differently, not just as distant lights or places to explore, but as questions waiting for someone brave enough to look past the obvious and into the dark. And she knew then that the test had not ended in that room, with the blinking timer and the vanishing figures. It had only just begun. The sun rose over the training compound with a glow that turned the steel walls gold and orange, but inside the halls no light could reach the lower levels, where Lena now walked through a corridor she had never seen before, lined with glass and silence, and empty rooms filled with machines she could not name. She had been told to report to level 13, a floor not marked on any cadet map, a floor without stairs or elevator buttons, a floor that revealed itself only after a file had been sealed and her status changed to restricted access. And now she was here alone, except for the lights that flickered on as she passed under them one by one. The corridor ended in a round chamber with black walls and a table in the center, shaped like a circle, where three others already sat waiting, without speaking, without moving, their eyes fixed on her, as she stepped into the room and stood across from them with her hand behind her back and her breathing calm and slow. They wore no uniforms, no ranks, no colors, only black coats with silver bands on their wrists, and the air around them felt different, not cold or hot, but still and heavy like the space between thoughts or the moment before a storm, and their faces gave away nothing, not even age or emotion or intent. One of them spoke, first a woman with dark eyes and a voice like paper sliding over glass, saying, "You passed a test that was not meant to be passed, not in that way, not by anyone, and certainly not by a first-year cadet from Sector 7 who never spoke and never stood out and never raised her hand." Another one leaned forward, a man with pale skin and fingers stained with ink or oil or something darker, saying, "What you saw in that room was not just code, not just a simulation, it was a key, and you turned it without knowing what door it opened or what might walk through." The third person did not speak, but placed a small object on the table, a round device with a dim red glow like a slow heartbeat. And when it touched the metal surface, the lights in the room dimmed, and the air grew warmer, as if the room itself was listening now, waiting to hear what would be said next. Lena looked at the object, then back at the three strangers, and said, "I saw the flaw, and I acted, that is all," and her voice did not tremble, because fear was something she had already faced and passed through and left behind like smoke in the wind. The woman smiled, then, not with warmth, but with approval, like someone watching a lock finally open after years of silence. And she said, "That is not all, because what you touched was not a glitch and not an accident. It was part of something old, something buried deep in the Academy's foundation, something placed there long before we arrived." The man with stained fingers said, "We have run that simulation for 9 years with over 7,000 cadets, and none of them saw what you saw. None of them found the switch. None of them heard the code or the code, except one other, and he vanished 3 days later without a trace, without a sound, without a single error in the logs." The third person finally spoke, his voice low and quiet like wind in an empty hall, and he said, "This was not the final test. It was the first real one, and now we must see if you are the one we have waited for, or just another voice in the storm." He touched the glowing object, and the walls of the room changed, turning transparent to reveal a new chamber beyond this one, filled with machines and drones and displays that showed images Lena had never seen before, maps of places with no names, coordinates outside the known systems, figures made of light with no faces or shapes that made sense. The woman said, "You will enter the next chamber alone, and you will sit in the chair at the center, and you will not move or speak until you are spoken to. And if you move or speak too early, you will fail. And if you lie or hide, you will fail. And if you pass, then the next step will reveal itself." Lena nodded once and stepped toward the wall, which opened like water parting before her, and she crossed into the new chamber, where the air smelled like ozone and old wires, and the hum of energy pulsed under the floor like a slow pulse, guiding her forward step by step. At the center stood the chair, black and simple, with wires coiled around its arms and a helmet resting above it like a crown, and she sat without hesitation, letting her hands rest flat and her feet stay still, and the helmet lowered onto her head with a whisper of metal and wind. She could not see now, and she could not hear, only the beat of her heart and the soft current in the wires that crawled over her skin like static, and inside her mind something opened, not like a door, but like a window, showing her flashes of images, memories that were not hers, voices speaking in languages she did not know, numbers spinning in patterns too fast to follow. Then a question came, not in sound, not in words, but in shape and feeling, and weight pressing into her chest like truth that demanded to be spoken, and she understood what was being asked, even if no words were used, because the question was simple and endless. "What do you fear?" She did not answer with her voice. She answered with her breath, with her memory, with the silence between the beats of her heart, and she thought of the system of the classroom, of the exam, and of the moment she stood alone and chose not to follow. And in that moment her answer came not as a word, but as a choice. To see. The images stopped, and the helmet lifted, and the room returned, and she was still breathing and still alive, and when she opened her eyes, the three strangers were standing before her, not behind the glass, not behind the desk, but here with her, their eyes now full of something close to respect. The man with the stained fingers handed her a small card with no name, only a symbol, a circle within a circle, and he said, "Welcome to Section 0. The woman added, "You will not return to the Academy, not as a cadet, not as a student, because you're neither now, you're something else, and your training starts now." The third man nodded once and said, "Follow us and learn what comes after the test, because this is the path that only 1 in 1,000 will ever walk, and even fewer will survive." Lena followed them through another door into a world she had not known existed, a place where shadows had names and secrets were taught like weapons, and fear was not something to avoid, but something to understand and use. And she walked without hesitation, because she had already made her move, and it had led her here, to the real beginning. The stars above the outer ring station blinked like quiet watchers as Lena stood on the edge of the observation deck, looking out at the galaxy that now felt closer and heavier than ever. Before her, reflection in the glass showed someone new, not the quiet girl in row 3, not the ghost with lowered eyes, but a shadow forged in light and silence shaped by pressure and choice and fire that burned without smoke. It had been 3 weeks since she passed the final trial inside Section 0, and each day since then had been a new kind of battle, a test, not of strength, but of will, of silence, of control, each task more strange and hidden than the last, with no praise, no warning, no breaks, and no map to follow. She had learned to read messages written in shifting light, to speak through locked thoughts, to detect lies and breathing patterns, to disarm drones using only sound, and to hide herself from machines that could see beyond walls, beyond heat, beyond even time. And yet none of it changed the part of her that remembered the classroom, the rows of cadets who once laughed behind her back, who looked through her like she was made of smoke and silence, who would never believe that she now walked through corridors that did not exist on any map of Earth Command. The woman from a circle room now called her by code, not named Phantom Zero, a title given only to those who passed all 7 layers of the trial, and accepted the final silence, the moment where identity melted into purpose and passed into mission. Today was different, though. Today, they had summoned her not for training, not for a test, but for her first real field assignment, a mission outside the walls of Section 0, a moment she had been told might never come, because most who passed the trials were never called again, their knowledge used in shadows, never in open moves. She stepped into the black room, where 3 shadows waited again, just like the first time, but this time the air did not feel heavy. It felt quiet, respectful, like a room that remembered what she had done and what she had become. The woman spoke first, saying, "A threat has surfaced beyond the outer colony, something that disrupts our sensors, hide from our long-range scans, and speaks in signals that do not match any known language, and we believe it may not be human." The man with the stained fingers added, "This is not war yet, but it could become one if we do not understand the shape of the voice and the nature of its silence. And you are the only one who has passed the listening phase with full clarity." The third shadow handed her a data crystal, small and cold and glowing faint red, and said, "This contains everything we know, which is almost nothing. Your task is to go to the derelict station orbiting Proxima K and listen not just with ears, but with the part of you that saw through the illusion, that broke the simulation, that chose to think wider than the test allowed." She took the crystal without a word, tucked it into her gear, and turned to go without asking for weapons or tools, because she had already become her own kind of weapon, of force shaped by patience and the power of waiting until the exact right moment to strike or to speak. The ship they gave her was silent and small, built without markings or noise, its systems responding to breath and thought, not buttons or screens. And as she launched into space, her mind felt like it was floating through a sea made of ink and memory, guided only by instinct and the silent pull of something waiting in the dark. The derelict station came into view like a shadow, with broken wings, half spinning, half frozen, its lights long dead, and its arms stretched toward a planet below that glowed faintly green, as if poisoned from within, and the air around it shimmered with static, like something unseen was whispering constantly, just outside the edge of sound. She docked with the station, entered alone, boots echoing through empty halls, walls stained with rust and dust, and something older than decay. And at the center, she found a room where the signal came from a round chamber lined with panels and wires, and a single seat facing a window that did not show stars, but instead a pulsing pattern of light like a heartbeat in slow motion. She sat and watched and waited and listened as the signal washed over her, not in sound, but in feeling waves of thought that touched her skin like cold wind, carrying meaning without shape and words without voice, and she let it flow through her without trying to control it, just like the test, just like the choice, just like the moment when she saw that the room was the threat. And then it shifted, the pulse becoming sharper, the feeling becoming clearer, and in her mind she heard a single message, not in her language, not in any known tongue, but she understood it anyway, because it was not spoken in words, it was spoken in choices. "You see." She breathed and closed her eyes, and replied in the same way, not with lips, not with sound, but with the weight of what she had done and the echo of every step she had taken to get here. And her answer was not fear or challenge or pride. It was readiness. The light blinked once, then twice, then vanished, and the station around her powered down fully, the hum ending the air, falling, still the message complete. When she returned to Earth Command, the 3 shadows were waiting again, but this time the woman bowed her head, slightly, not as an order, but as a recognition, and said you were not sent to fight, you were sent to listen, and you heard what no system could translate. The man added, we do not yet know if what you touched is threat or ally or something between, but now we know how to listen, and that is because of you. The third said your name has passed through channels where names do not go, and while the world will never know you saved at your signal, will always be part of the silent code that watches from the dark. And so she walked away again into halls without names and ships, without lights or story hidden from the surface, but written in the systems that kept the stars safe from things not yet understood. No longer the quiet girl, no longer the forgotten cadet, no longer the ghost in row 3. Now, she was the listener, the watcher, the first to understand the voice from the silence. The phantom of the system. The last one they suspected. The only one who saw.